Today, I'm going to be ranking every Vanderlyn gang member by their importance to the gang. 95% of my viewers are unsubscribed, so if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe. In very last place, 24th place, it has to be Molly O'Shea. She was not important at all to the gang, and she was only important in keeping Dutch reined in during the game, and she didn't even really do that because he was off doing stuff with other women. I mean, like Mary Beth at least, and just in general, she didn't really satisfy him in any way, and he didn't really want to satisfy her in any way. So she really has no actual importance to the game at all, and is just a drag on resources because she is Dutch's lover, and because she eventually does betray the gang in some way. Even though they don't get anything out of her, she does, betray the gang on her own accord. So she just really is someone that's not important to the gang at all. You could take her out and it'd basically be the exact same without her. And also, she's just taking away resources from other people who could use them. And when they're actually have a crunch on resources throughout the entire game, this is someone you can easily kick to the curb and basically nothing would change. So Molly O'Shea definitely has to go in F tier for importance to the gang. In 23rd place, I hate to say it, but it is Jack Marston. This guy, besides being a little kid, he really just hurts the entire gang as a whole because he takes away one member because, someone has to care for him at all times. Mostly it's Abigail, but, someone has to kind of care for him at all times because what if he slips off? And that's exactly what did happen. And that's why the Braithwaite Manor, assault whole thing happened. So this guy just does not add anything to the gang. He doesn't provide anything for the game. I just see him sitting on his ass all game. And this guy isn't going out fishing, hunting. He does do the one thing with Arthur, but I don't think he catches any fish. He makes a fucking flower necklace instead. I don't get what this guy is doing all game. He needs to go out there and get a fucking job. Either way, though, Jack really isn't providing anything to the gang. And if there was no Jack there, I feel like the gang as a whole would be more productive just because you free up someone that was potentially before playing with Jack or doing something with Jack or just having an eye out for him, and instead gain them to, do an actual job. So Jack Marston, of course, has to go into F tier because he literally doesn't bring anything to the gang and he makes them less productive as a whole. But I mean, he's a kid, so I'll have to, I'll keep it in F tier, but I'll put him a little bit higher. In 22nd place, it's my boy, Reverend Swanson. Reverend Swanson clearly doesn't do anything around camp. He's drained on resources, and, maybe while he does say some stuff priest-like, and he keeps them in a good, chipper, Christian, Catholic, whatever he is in terms of being a priest. He keeps them in that kind of nice mood, and maybe he says some stuff to everyone about that. He really is just a drain on resources as a whole for the whole entire team because he's not providing anything. He's just drinking a bunch, which probably costs some money. I don't know if he's paying for out of his own pocket or he's just taking the gang's, alcohol, but he's just not doing anything for the gang, and he's just taking stuff from them, and he's not being productive at all, and he's just eating one share of food that could go to someone else. So, Reverend Swanson definitely has to go into D tier, and if they got rid of him, I feel like it wouldn't really change the atmosphere much, and the gang probably could be potentially more productive without him, or maybe even just a little bit less productive, and you lose one member, so overall more efficient, more productive, but definitely Reverend Swanson D tier. In 21st place, I hate to say it, but it's Abigail Marson, whatever you want to call her. She's just not important to the gang at all, just because her only job is to take care of Jack. And Jack also, similarly, is not important to the gang in the same right. Maybe you can say they're important because they keep John in check, but at the same time, they do have plans to get out of there. Abigail's whole plan is to get out of the gang life. And I think that is kind of what takes her down as well, because she is trying to get one of the more important members, John, out of the gang life. So, taking away someone that's actually important to the gang and actually provides to the gang definitely takes her down in terms of importance because, she's taking someone good out of the gang. But I just think in general, she doesn't really provide anything. There's one point where Miss Grimshaw says, Abigail, you got to start whoring yourself out again. And that kind of shows that, Abigail really isn't providing anything to the gang as being a mother. And of course, Dutch is going to provide for them because he's not going to just leave a mother and her child out to drown like that. And they want to keep John in the gang because John is a close member of their family, if you want to call it that. But I just think Abigail doesn't really provide anything. And that's why she has to go into D tier, very sadly. In 20th place, I've got Kieran Duffy. Sadly, Kieran doesn't provide anything while he's with the gang. There's only one mission that he's actually in where he saves Arthur's life. Well, you could say that is pretty important in its own right. He doesn't ever do anything as a gunslinger, and he only has like one other mission with Arthur where he goes fishing before his head is in his hands and he's dead. So I feel like Kieran just isn't a very important guy. Like, of course, if he did provide some information on Colm, which he does a little bit, like he does tell them about the 6 Point cabin, but, you know, Arthur was like, get out of here, Kieran. But, you know, because he did save his life, he had to keep him there. But I just think in general, Kieran is not important at all to the gang. He just doesn't really provide anything. If they got rid of him after, you know, Colm, they took over Colm's cabin, it wouldn't really change the gang at all, and if anything, they'd probably be just as productive as before. So I think he has to go into C tier. He's not really providing anything, but he's not really like a drain on resources like some of the other people have been. In 19th place, I've got Mary Beth. Very sadly, like, Mary Beth is a very smart person. She's a good pickpocket, and she's a very charismatic person. And potentially, Dutch had his eye on her for his next woman, next lover. But I just don't think she's that important to the gang at all. Like, she is a pickpocket and whatnot, but I just think her, Tilly, and Karen kind of all drag the gang down just because they're not really providing that much like petty thief stuff and potential leads. Like, Mary Beth does get a lead for, I believe, the robbing of a house, but I just think in general, Mary Beth, Tilly, and Karen aren't really providing all that much to the gang, and they're just kind of a little bit of a drain on resources. So she also has to go into C tier. In 18th place, I've got Tilly. Maybe Tilly should be below Mary Beth. I don't really know. They're kind of all at the same level. And I just think Tilly should be a little bit higher because she does take care of the worst member in the gang, who's Jack Marston. So, like, she does provide a little bit in that sense where she's, like, being a little efficient in that sense. And she also has some, like, solid robbing and whatnot, like with Mary Beth and with Karen. But of course, they're not really providing that much. Like, they are, I guess, clean up camp a little bit, and like they're doing, you know, odd jobs around camp, probably helping when they actually have to move. But I just don't think Tilly is that important to the gang. They could kick her out and it wouldn't really change much. Like, you know, they probably do want women around camp just because it's a nice thing to have around camp, but there's not really like any actual benefits that any of these women are really providing. So I think Tilly also has to go into C tier. In 17th place, I've got the man, the myth, the legend, Uncle. And Uncle clearly is not, you know, a great person for the camp. He kind of gets this lazy lifestyle infected with some people. And just in general, he is a drain on resources, but he does have some times when he actually does have a use. And the fact that he's actually used in some missions and potentially tries to do some stuff, get some leads and whatnot, and is, you know, a solid enough gunman, shows that he does have some importance to the gang, but clearly he's not providing much, if anything, to the gang as a whole, and he's just a drain on resources. So I think he also has to go into C tier, but he does have a little bit more valuableness just because he can't handle a gun. In 16th place, I've got Karen Jones. Karen is just a little bit higher than these other people because while she does drink a lot and she does do a lot of things, she's a great actor and she's actually good at robbing compared to someone like Mary Beth or Tilly. But I think very, very similarly to Uncle, she just is really, really lazy and she doesn't really do much around camp. I mean, Grimshaw kind of always gets mad at her and the other girls because they're not doing shit around camp. And just in general, they're not really providing that much. But I think Karen does have the highest amount of them just because she is a good gunslinger and she does take part in the bank robbery in Valentine. So I think that is probably the best that any of these like 4 members have done. But still, since she doesn't do that much, I think she also has to go into C tier with these other ladies and Uncle. In 15th place, I've got Sadie Adler. This is more because they don't really use her in the same kind of weaponry that they do some of the other men in the gang, and she's not really involved in many of the actual quests to do stuff for the gang. Sadie is a very talented gun woman, and she does kind of have a little mean streak, so she can be doing stuff, but I feel like Dutch never really involves her in anything. And just because she did get a really, really late start to the gang when she joined in chapter 1, I feel like Dutch doesn't really trust her, similar to Kieran, where he's just underutilized. She's also underutilized in the same way, and that kind of takes down her importance to the gang. While she is very important to some of the missions that Arthur does, and like breaking John out of the penitentiary, that doesn't really pertain to the overall Van der Linde gang story, because it's not something that really benefits the Van der Linde gang, because, you know, it does bring the police down on them a little bit more. And, you know, of course, breaking John out is great for John and Arthur and Sadie, who all want John out. It doesn't really benefit the Van der Linde gang as a whole, and it isn't really a Dutch or a Van der Linde gang mission. So I think I'm going to have to put her in B tier, because she could be super important and efficient and productive if she was used in a good way, but she's just not really. So I think she has to go into B tier for sure. In 14th place, I've got Mr. Lenny Summers, and Lenny definitely is productive in his own way, but clearly compared to some of the other members, he's not as productive because he kind of has to do stuff with Arthur. It seems like whenever he's with Arthur, that's when he's actually doing stuff that makes sense. But like Lenny also talks to Arthur about how, oh, Shawn and all these other people are getting these big scores and I'm not. So he's just not that important to the gang. He does bring in some stuff to the gang, and it seems like he's a really fun person to have around camp. But I just think in terms of the gunslingers, he's probably one of the worst gunslingers, and he's not included in as many missions as some of these other people are. I mean, I guess he is, but he's kind of like the fodder for everyone else. Like, he's the guy that goes in first. He's the guy that seems like the first guy in. They're kind of just trying to teach him the ropes, and, you know, eventually it does get him killed in that way. But I think because he's not as important, he's kind of thrown in as the fodder in a lot of these missions, which results in him getting killed. But he's still a very important member to the gang, just being a gunman. So I think he has to go in B tier, but pretty low end of B tier. In 13th place, I've got Bill Williamson. Bill is definitely a better gunslinger than someone like Lenny, but he's just not that smart. And like, kind of because of that, he can't be that important in his own right. I mean, any gunslinger in the Van der Linde gang has to be pretty important, but I think Bill isn't really included on a lot of these things just because there's no intellect from him. And while he does have a really, really good plan to rob the Valentine Bank, like, that's kind of the only thing where I'd be like, oh wow, that's actually a really good idea by Bill. Everything else is just kind of like he's a guy that's thrown in on the side to be a good gunslinger. And, you know, while he does hold that up pretty solidly, I don't think he does much else that well. And I think he's just kind of one of the gunslingers they have in the gang. Kind of similar with Lenny. It's like when you're one of fucking like 7 or 8 gunslingers in the gang, you can't be that important in your own right because there's 7 other guys that do the exact same job as you, potentially even better than you. So I think he also has to go into B tier, but I mean, he's still pretty important to the gang. In 12th place, I've got Javier Esella. I think Javier is a little bit more included in some of the bigger things like robbing the boat with Arthur and Trani and Strauss, and also, you know, being pretty important in the bank robbery, doing stuff in Guarma, and also in the train robbery at the end. I think he's a more important character than someone like Bill or Lenny on those bigger missions, but he's still kind of in the same thing. He's just an expendable gunslinger in the gang. He doesn't really have that big of a role in the gang, so I can't really put him any higher than B tier, but I think he just does have a bigger role than people like Bill or Lenny, so he's just going to go a little bit higher than them in B tier. In 11th place, I've got Miss Grimshaw, and honestly, I might be underrating her with the 11th place here, just because she does keep everything clean, a lot of people in check, and probably, you know, takes care of the camp better than some people, like keeping the people like Swanson and Uncle, and not having them just be lazy fucks all day. Like, she probably does keep them in check a little bit more, but I'm just wondering what would happen if she is gone. Like, would someone else step up in her place, like Tilly, Mary Beth, or Karen? Like, would they try and step up? Or does she kind of rule her own dictatorship where it's actually maybe not as productive having her be the leader? I don't know. It could really go either way, but I think she is a pretty important member in the gang. And for someone who literally isn't involved in any actual missions, it's a pretty high role. And I think she definitely has to go into B tier just because keeping the gang clean, fed, you know, clothed and all that, and just keeping them clean in general is probably a pretty important task, and definitely has to keep her at least into B tier. In 10th place, I've got Mr. Trani. There's a reason why they always go back and save this man, because he is such an important member of the gang, because he's such a great con man. But at the same time, if they didn't have him, they'd probably just go for a lot more of the stuff that they don't need an elaborate, very, very smart man. So like, they don't really need Trelawney because he doesn't provide that much like all the time. But when he does, it's always something extremely big. So it's like, he's also not really taking anything from the gang. Like, he is there sometimes and he does talk to people and whatnot and probably eat some of the meals, but he does have his own life in his own house. So I think he is a very important member, but if they didn't have him, I feel like they'd just be a little bit worse off and they wouldn't like really need him. Not much would change in my opinion. So I think he has to go into B tier, but when he does get those big rewards, they go crazy. In 9th place, I've got Micah Bell. Might be controversial to some of you people, but Micah definitely is a very, very important member in the gang, and he does provide a lot. He does come up with some solidly smart plans. A lot of them do backfire just because we don't really know what he's playing at. Is he always trying to do the best thing for the gang? Is he not? But he still is one of the best gunslingers in the entire gang, and he does come up with some smart ideas with Dutch from time to time. So I think he is a very, very important member, but more of just someone as a good gunslinger and someone who sometimes comes up with solid ideas. Overall, though, he's probably not that important to the gang, and he kind of just does get overstated because when other people start dying and Hosea dies and Dutch kind of loses trust with Arthur and John, that's when Micah kind of pops up. But I think the majority of the rest of the gang and like game, like he doesn't really seem like the top member in the gang. So I think he has to go into B tier, but he's still a very, very solid member and very, very important. In 8th place, I've got Shawn Maguire. I think Shawn is an underrated member in terms of importance. Of course, they do go back for him, but I think they'd kind of go back for any member of the gang if they did leave him. That's what they did say with, like, I think Mac was the guy who they left behind and got shot by Milton. But just in general, I think Shawn is a very like underrated member because he kind of is involved in stuff, even if he's not the ideas man, but he's like involved in it and he's kind of doing the best of his abilities. And it seems like Lenny was saying, oh, Shawn got this big raid or this big robbery. And it's like, it seems like Shawn is always doing stuff on his own and still providing for the gang in that way. So he is someone that definitely is carrying more than just his weight, and I think is a pretty important member of the gang. And it just seems like everything went downhill after his death. So I think there is an importance in that way because, you know, he also is this really funny guy who's kind of keeping up the spirits of everyone. And when he eventually does die, it kind of just all goes downhill after that. So I think he's also in B tier because you can't really overstate his importance with all these things, but I still think he is a little bit more important than some of these other gunmen in the gang. In 7th place, I've got Charles Smith. And I think Charles is basically the same as a lot of these other gunmen in the gang. He kind of just provides and does everything, but the fact that he's also a great tracker, you know, gives him a little bit of more of an ability in some of these other missions, and the fact that he also just does things on his own and also provides for the gang in that way, to me, puts him a little bit higher. He just has a little bit more skills than some of these other people, so I don't really think he provides that much more than some of these other guys, especially in the B tier, but he's involved in a couple more of the missions. He seems like a very, very smart guy. I mean, especially in the Saint Denis robbery where he does get everyone to follow him and then they get off on a boat, and he's willing to kind of risk his life for everyone else. He's a very selfless guy. So I think that all kind of boils into him being a little bit more valuable than everyone from the B tier. So I'm going to put him at the very bottom of A tier because these next two guys are a lot more important than Charles, in my opinion, to the gang. In 6th place, it's Mr. John Marston. John is a very, very important member to the gang. He's basically just like all the people in B tier. He can shoot a gun, he can do all that, but he's a little bit more intelligent, and just the fact that he's a lot closer with Hosea and Dutch, the two leaders of the gang, puts him a little bit higher in that sense because they do trust him with things, and they always kind of have him in these bigger moments. Like John always kind of has a bigger role in like these robberies and whatnot. And I don't know, he's just always doing things, especially with Arthur. So I think he does have a bigger role and a little bit more importance than some of these other people. Of course, there is like a familial importance between like Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and John. But I just think the fact that he's actually like a little bit intelligent and they actually trust him to like run with their plans, especially when they do rob the Braithwaites of their horses, and like he's the one who's doing the dealings with the Greys. Like they do think he's a little bit smarter than some of these other people, and they do trust him a little bit more. So he is a lot more important than, you know, I think a lot of the other gunslingers in the B tier. So he definitely has to go into A tier for me. In 5th place, I've got Arthur Morgan. Arthur Morgan, yeah, again, is just like John Marston, but a little bit more entrenched in the gang. So, he is shooting, he is doing all that, but he is doing a little bit more of the brainy things. He's doing the stuff for Strauss, which I think is pretty important in its own right. And just, he's doing a lot more things that involve a little bit more brains and a little bit more trust than some of the other members, because you can't really trust them as much. Of course, it's probably a little bit overstated in the gang, and just because you are playing as Arthur Morgan, so it's like some of these other gang members in real life would probably do stuff instead of Arthur. Like, it's like maybe Arthur wouldn't be doing all of the debt collection missions and like every single thing from Dutch. Of course, he'd probably be doing more than everyone else, but like he's probably not involved in every single one of these missions if this was a real thing. But I still think he would be involved in more than these other members, and I think just because of that, he is one of the most important members to the gang. And while he doesn't really have any like skill set that would put him higher than some of these other people, everyone else can kind of shoot as well as he does. He's just kind of a little bit better than everyone else in that sense, and just the fact that Hosea and Dutch can trust him, that has to put him at the very, very top of A tier. In 4th place, I've got Pearson, and people might be asking me, why is Pearson above Arthur? Pearson is actually the secret link between all of these people. If you have 20 people in camp, you can't always buy food from the store for them, and I'm assuming when there was a smaller gang, they were probably, buying more food and like, at least sufficing themselves on some like bad cooking. But the fact that Pearson is actually a good cook, can always cook for the entire gang, I feel like if you took Pearson away from the gang, potentially they'd crumble on their own. Like with that many people, especially at the beginning of the game, like as time goes on with the game, there isn't like as many people, so it's like you don't have to provide for as many people. But when there is like 20 people in this gang, Pearson cooking and being good at cooking just helps everyone stay a little bit longer, and just helps provide for everyone, because he makes stew every single day for 20 plus people. So it's like that is one of the most important things in the entire like gang's thing, like the gang's hierarchy. Of course, you got like the leaders of the gang, but Pearson is up there, and he's just like one of the most important members, because he's providing something for everyone else that if you took him away, it'd be either a lot less efficient or just worse. And just, I feel like it kind of crumble in its own way if you took Pearson away from the gang. So Pearson definitely is a very, very important member, and that's why I think he has to go into S tier. He's providing so much more to the gang than some of these other people below him. So definitely has to go into S tier for me. In 3rd place, I've got Strauss, and while Strauss really can't do anything on his own, he does have Arthur being his bitch, collecting the debts for him. This man is making so much money. Like the debt collection, I'm assuming, is probably making a ton of money. Like the debt collection isn't making that much money on its own, but it's like they don't show all the debts that actually don't get repaid, or like do get repaid is what I'm saying, beforehand, and they actually make a ton of interest off that. Like it's probably a 50-50 collection rate, but I'm saying every single person that actually is paying their interest back is probably making a ton of money off of that. And just in general, like Strauss kind of does everything. He's like the 3rd leader of the gang, because he does everything behind the scenes. He sets up a new address, a new thing for all the mail to be sent to. It's like Strauss does everything to just help the gang get on their feet when they do move to a new location. I think that's why he's a very, very underrated character in terms of his importance. He makes a ton of money for the gang, sets them up with a lot of stuff, probably does a lot of stuff behind the scenes, like bookkeeping, accounting stuff. And it's like, this is the stuff that is really like ugly on its own sense, but I think really probably helps keep the gang together and helps keep everyone staying accountable and being accountable. So I think Strauss also has to go into S tier. He's a very, very important member for the gang. Maybe if they do lose him, like it wouldn't be that much different, but I still think he has to go into S tier. In 2nd place, it's Dutch van der Linde. There's one simple thing that puts him into this spot. Is there a van der Linde gang without Dutch van der Linde? No, there's not. Because, first off, it is the van der Linde gang. But I'm saying because of Dutch's charisma and just him being this really interesting guy to follow and be around and just, have a plan for everyone. Like, he is the guy that's leading the entire gang, and he is the person where all the brains come from, basically. And without him, like, if you take him away, it's not going to be the Hosea Matthews gang. Like, I'm sure Arthur and John and all these people could do well on their own, but without Dutch, there's no one to lead everyone. Like there's no 24-person gang without Dutch. Potentially these people could run, like 5-person gangs on their own. Bill eventually does, but I'm saying without Dutch, there is no Van der Linde gang. And I think that's why he's probably one of the most important characters in the gang. While he doesn't provide a lot of this stuff, like beside just being this charisma man and coming up with plans, he is just the reason the whole gang's around. So that's why he definitely has to go into S tier. He's just the whole reason the gang's a thing. In first place, though, it is for me Hosea Matthews. I think Hosea is a little bit more important in his own weird way to Dutch, just because he does kind of hold Dutch down. Dutch has a lot of these crazy ideas that will sometimes work and sometimes won't work, and Hosea kind of reins that in a lot of the time. And he does a lot of the behind the scenes stuff with Strauss, and he's not as like flashy of a character as someone like Dutch is. Like he kind of just does, the behind the scenes stuff, the stuff that needs to be done and Dutch doesn't want to do because he's off, being charismatic and whatnot. So I think Hosea really holds it down, and you see once his death does happen, Dutch kind of falls apart, and he can't really do it on his own because he needs someone to like work with him. It's like Lennon and McCartney. There needs to be a second guy with him because on his own, he's not performing to his A game. He does still have some of those A game ideas, but they need to be working with someone else to really pull it off. So I think Hosea is a little bit more important in that way, just because he does push Dutch to the best of his abilities, and he does a lot of that behind the scenes stuff, and that's why he has to be first place for me, and also an S tier in terms of importance to the Van der Linde gang. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you guys would change anything, put in the comments, and there should be some videos popping up right now, so go click on them.